Harriet Voss came within a matter of weeks of adding her son's name to her house, her bank account, her car, her life insurance, and a small family cabin, all in the name of simplifying her affairs. A single question from an attorney, asked almost in passing, stopped her just in time. This is the story of the 5 mistakes she nearly made and what she learned instead. This is her story. Harriet is 72, widowed, 3 years, a former head nurse at a regional hospital in Indiana, retired for 9 years. She lives alone in the modest home she and her late husband, Frank, bought decades ago, and has 2 adult children, Dennis, 47, and Patricia, 43. A minor fall in her kitchen several months ago, one that resulted in nothing more than a bruised hip and a genuine scare, sent Harriet into a familiar common line of thinking. She wanted urgently, and with real love behind it, to get her affairs in order, to make things simple for her children in case anything more serious happened down the road. Harriet had spent 38 years as a nurse, the last 15 of them managing an entire hospital floor, a career built on careful attention to detail and an instinct for anticipating problems before they became emergencies. That same instinct turned toward her own mortality after the fall, convinced her that acting quickly and decisively was the responsible thing to do. What she hadn't yet learned in those first anxious weeks was that the specific way she planned to act carried risks considerably more serious than the fall itself had posed. It was a well-meaning impulse. It very nearly led her somewhere considerably more complicated than she intended. The idea that set everything in motion came from her longtime neighbor, Walt, 76, over coffee one Saturday morning, shortly after Harriet's fall. "You know, Harriet, the easiest thing in the world is just to put your kids' names on everything now," Walt said, stirring sugar into his cup with the confidence of a man who had done exactly this himself years earlier. "Saves everybody the headache of probate. Saves you lawyer fees, and it's done in an afternoon. I did it with my daughter years ago. Simple as anything." Harriet, still a little shaken from her fall and genuinely eager to protect her children from complications after she was gone, found the suggestion appealing in its simplicity. Over the following 2 weeks, she began quietly working through a mental list of everything she owned that seemed worth simplifying in exactly this way. Walt, for his part, believed every word of what he'd told her. His own experience adding his daughter's name to his assets years earlier had, as far as he knew, gone smoothly, and he had no particular reason to question the wisdom of advice that had apparently worked out fine for his own family. It never occurred to him, offering the suggestion over coffee that Saturday morning, that his daughter's circumstances and Dennis's might turn out to be considerably different, or that the very same advice could land so differently, depending on what was actually happening, quietly, in the life of the person whose name was being added. The first item on Harriet's list was the deed to her house, the same modest 3-bedroom home where she and Frank had raised both their children, paid off in full for over a decade. Her plan, forming clearly in her mind over that first week, was straightforward. Add Dennis, her older child, as a co-owner on the deed, reasoning that since he lived nearby and would likely handle most of the practical matters after she was gone, it made sense for the house to already carry his name alongside hers. What Harriet didn't fully understand, and what nearly cost her considerably more than she realized, was that adding Dennis as a co-owner wouldn't simply be a formality reserved for some future date. It would make him a legal owner of the house immediately, exposing that ownership to anything happening in his own life, present or future, entirely separate from Harriet's own circumstances. The second item was her primary bank account, the one holding the bulk of her retirement savings and monthly pension income. Harriet's plan here was similarly simple in her own mind. Add Dennis as a joint account holder, not merely someone with signing authority in an emergency, but a full co-owner of the account itself, again reasoning that this would make things easier for him to manage her affairs if anything happened to her suddenly. She had no idea, forming this plan, that joint ownership of a bank account can, in many circumstances, expose the entire account, not merely a symbolic half, to any creditor or legal claim against the co-owner, regardless of whose money actually funded it in the first place. The third item was her car, a reliable sedan she still drove herself several times a week. Harriet's reasoning here mirrored the house and the bank account, adding Dennis's name to the title just in case she ever needed help managing it, or in case something happened to her while she was still driving it regularly. The fourth item concerned her life insurance policy. A modest but meaningful sum Frank had insured was in place decades earlier. Reviewing the policy's paperwork one evening, Harriet noticed that Dennis was currently listed as the sole beneficiary, a decision made years earlier during a period when Patricia had been going through a difficult financial stretch, and Harriet and Frank had privately agreed at the time that Dennis would simply divide things fairly with his sister once the funds arrived. Rather than updating the policy to formally reflect both children, Harriet's initial instinct was simply to leave the existing arrangement in place, trusting the same informal understanding to hold years later exactly as it always had in her own mind. The fifth and final item was a small family cabin on a lake about an hour from Harriet's house, purchased jointly by Harriet and Frank decades earlier, a place full of childhood memories for both Dennis and Patricia. Harriet's plan here was to transfer partial ownership to Dennis specifically, reasoning that as the older child, he would naturally take the lead on maintaining the property going forward, and that having his name already on the title would simplify that eventual transition considerably. It was Harriet's daughter, Patricia, who first raised a note of caution during a phone call in which Harriet mentioned casually, and with some pride at her own organizational efforts, everything she'd been planning to simplify over the following month. "Mom, that sounds like a lot of big legal changes happening pretty quickly, based on something Walt told you over coffee," Patricia said carefully. "Have you actually talked to a lawyer about any of this?" Harriet, a little defensive, explained that Walt had done exactly the same thing himself, successfully, and that hiring an attorney seemed like an unnecessary expense for something that seemed, on its face, fairly straightforward. Patricia, unconvinced, but not wanting to push too hard, gently suggested that even a single consultation with an actual estate attorney couldn't hurt, simply to confirm that Walt's advice, however well-intentioned, was actually sound. Harriet, mostly to placate her daughter rather than out of any real uncertainty of her own, agreed to schedule a single meeting before finalizing anything. Patricia had always been the more cautious of Harriet's two children, a trait that had occasionally frustrated Harriet over the years, who sometimes found her daughter's careful, deliberate approach to decisions slower than she preferred. This time, though, that same caution would prove to be exactly the intervention Harriet's plan actually needed. Patricia hung up the phone that evening, still faintly uneasy, unable to point to any specific problem with her mother's plan, but carrying a persistent low-grade instinct that something about moving quickly on 5 major asset decisions based entirely on one neighbor's casual advice deserved more scrutiny than it had received so far. That single meeting with an attorney named Mrs. Kessler turned out to be one of the more consequential hours of Harriet's entire retirement. Mrs. Kessler listened carefully as Harriet described her full plan: the house, the bank account, the car, the insurance policy, the family cabin. Nodding along, taking careful notes, her expression giving away little until Harriet finished describing the final item. Mrs. Voss, I want to walk through each of these individually because I think you may not be aware of some significant risks buried inside what sounds, on its surface, like a very reasonable simplification plan, Mrs. Kessler said. She began with the house. If you add Dennis as a co-owner on your deed, you're not simply preparing the house to pass to him eventually. You're making him a legal owner right now, today. That means if Dennis is ever sued, if he accumulates significant debt, or if he goes through something like a contentious divorce, your house, the actual physical roof over your head, could potentially become an asset considered as part of those circumstances, entirely separate from your own life and your own choices. Harriet blinked, genuinely surprised. I hadn't thought about it that way at all. I just assumed it would simplify things for him later. Mrs. Kessler nodded. That's an incredibly common assumption, and it's exactly why this particular piece of advice circulates so widely among well-meaning friends and neighbors. There's actually a much safer tool available for exactly what you're trying to accomplish: a transfer on death deed. It allows the house to pass directly to Dennis upon your death, avoiding probate entirely without making him a legal co-owner while you're still alive and still needing full, unencumbered control over your own home. She paused, letting that distinction settle before continuing. I see this exact scenario more often than you might expect, Mrs. Voss. A parent hears that adding a child's name avoids probate, which is technically true, but nobody explains the considerable trade-off buried inside that convenience. You'd be handing over real legal exposure in exchange for a problem that has much safer, equally effective solutions available. Moving to the bank account, Mrs. Kessler explained a similarly serious risk. Joint ownership means exactly that. Joint. In many circumstances, if Dennis has creditors, unpaid debts, or legal judgments against him, they may be able to reach funds in that account, even though the money is entirely yours, earned entirely through your own working life and pension. What should I do instead if I want him to be able to help manage things? Harriet asked. A limited financial power of attorney accomplishes almost everything you're hoping for without the ownership risk, Mrs. Kessler explained. It allows Dennis to act on your behalf, managing the account and paying bills if you're ever unable to do so yourself, without ever making him a legal owner exposed to his own separate financial circumstances. The car title carried a similar, if smaller scale, risk. If Dennis is a co-owner of your vehicle and you're ever involved in an accident, even one that's genuinely not your fault, he could potentially be named in resulting legal action simply by virtue of shared ownership. It's a small risk in isolation, but it's an entirely unnecessary one, given how easily it can be avoided. Harriet considered this point quietly for a moment, thinking of the countless ordinary trips she still made in that car every week: the grocery store, church, her regular Tuesday lunch with old co-workers from the hospital. It had never once occurred to her that something as routine as an accidental fender bender in a parking lot could ripple outward into her son's legal life. Simply because his name happened to sit alongside hers on a piece of paper, filed away in a drawer somewhere. When the conversation reached the life insurance policy, Mrs. Kessler's tone shifted slightly, growing more direct. Naming only Dennis as beneficiary, based on an informal understanding that he'll divide things fairly with Patricia afterward, is one of the riskier arrangements I see in my practice. Informal promises like that aren't legally binding in any way. Even with the very best intentions, circumstances change. Financial pressure, marital difficulties, simple human nature under the weight of a large, sudden sum of money. I'd strongly recommend naming both of your children directly as beneficiaries, with a formally documented split, rather than relying on an informal handshake agreement to hold up exactly as promised years down the road. Harriet thought immediately of Dennis's current divorce, understanding for the first time exactly how relevant Mrs. Kessler's warning had suddenly become. A large insurance payout arriving in the middle of contentious divorce proceedings, intended informally to be split with Patricia but legally belonging entirely to Dennis alone, could easily become entangled in the settlement itself, potentially leaving Patricia with nothing at all despite the family's original well-meaning intentions. Finally, addressing the family cabin, Mrs. Kessler raised a practical complication Harriet genuinely hadn't considered. If you transfer partial ownership to Dennis now, any future decision about that property, selling it, refinancing it, even significant repairs requiring a loan, will require his consent alongside yours. If his life circumstances change in ways that complicate that consent, you may find yourself unable to make decisions about your own property without his direct involvement and agreement. And given what's happening with his divorce, Mrs. Kessler added carefully, his own share of that cabin could potentially become a subject of negotiation in the settlement, which would mean Patricia's childhood memories tied up in that property could end up entangled in a legal proceeding that has nothing to do with her at all. Then, almost as a routine procedural question, Mrs. Kessler asked something that would change the entire trajectory of Harriet's afternoon. Mrs. Voss, before we go any further, I need to ask, is Dennis currently involved in any active lawsuits, significant debt, or a divorce proceeding that I should be aware of, given how directly it could affect several of these plans? Harriet paused, genuinely uncertain how to answer. He mentioned a few months ago that he and his wife were separating. He didn't go into much detail and I didn't want to pry. I assumed it was fairly amicable. Mrs. Kessler's expression remained professionally neutral, though her next words carried real weight. I'd strongly encourage you to have a direct conversation with him about exactly where that stands before we finalize anything today. Divorce proceedings can become considerably more complicated and contentious than either party initially expects, and any asset with his name attached, even partially, could potentially become part of those proceedings. Harriet left that meeting deeply unsettled and called Dennis that same evening, asking more directly than she had in months exactly how his separation was actually proceeding. What followed was a considerably longer and more honest conversation than any they'd had on the subject previously. Dennis admitted with visible reluctance that the divorce had grown significantly more contentious over the past several weeks, that his soon-to-be ex-wife's attorney had begun aggressively examining every asset, even remotely connected to him, and that things were, in his own words, messier than I wanted to worry you with. He told her, haltingly at first, and then with more detail as the conversation continued, about the mounting legal fees, the increasingly hostile tone of the negotiations over the past month, and his own private fear that things might get considerably worse before they got better. He admitted, too, that he had specifically avoided sharing the full picture with his mother, not wanting to add to her worries so soon after her fall, telling himself that the details weren't really relevant to her own life or decisions. He hadn't considered until this exact conversation how directly relevant those details actually were to a plan he'd barely paid attention to when Harriet first mentioned it weeks earlier. Harriet sat with that information for a long moment after hanging up the phone, doing an uncomfortable piece of math about timing. Had she followed through with her original plan even 2 or 3 weeks earlier, before that consultation with Mrs. Kessler, her own house, the physical roof over her own head, paid off after decades of careful saving, could have become entangled in her son's increasingly hostile divorce proceedings, an outcome that would have devastated both of them and accomplished nothing resembling the simple, loving gesture she had originally intended. "Mom, I had no idea things had gotten this complicated when Walt first mentioned putting your name, my name, on things," Dennis said, genuinely shaken once he understood the full picture. "I would never have wanted you exposed to any of this." "I know," Harriet said. "None of us saw it clearly until someone whose actual job is seeing these things pointed it out directly." In the weeks that followed, Harriet returned to Mrs. Kessler's office and implemented one by one the safer alternatives to each of her original 5 plans. The house was structured with a transfer on death deed, ensuring it would pass directly to Dennis upon Harriet's death, entirely avoiding probate without exposing it to any complications in his ongoing divorce. The bank account remained solely in Harriet's name, with a limited financial power of attorney granted to Dennis, allowing him to help manage her affairs if ever needed, without making him a legal co-owner vulnerable to his own separate financial circumstances. The car title stayed exclusively in Harriet's name, with clear instructions in her will about how it should transfer after her death. Each appointment with Mrs. Kessler took less time than Harriet expected, and cost considerably less than she had originally feared when Walt first suggested that avoiding an attorney entirely was the more economical path. By the end of the process, Harriet found herself reflecting on how close she had come to trading a modest legal fee for a set of risks that could have cost her family far more in both money and heartache than any amount of attorney's fees ever could have. The life insurance policy was formally updated to name both Dennis and Patricia as beneficiaries, with a clearly documented, legally binding split between them, removing the informal, unwritten promise that had quietly carried real risk for years without Harriet ever fully realizing it. And the family cabin remained entirely in Harriet's name, with specific, clear instructions written into her will about how ownership should eventually transfer to both of her children jointly once she was no longer living, rather than through a premature partial transfer that could have complicated her own ability to manage the property in the meantime. Patricia, once she learned the full extent of what her simple, cautious phone call had ultimately helped prevent, admitted to feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease, grateful that her instinct had proven correct, but shaken by how close the family had come to a genuinely serious mistake, made entirely with love, entirely without malice, simply through a well-intentioned piece of advice that turned out to be considerably more dangerous than anyone at that Saturday coffee table had realized. Harriet also had a longer, more honest conversation with Dennis about his divorce, offering genuine emotional support without ever again considering entangling her own assets in the middle of his legal proceedings. "I want to help you through this as your mother," she told him. "That's different from accidentally putting my own security at risk trying to help you financially before we even understood what we were dealing with." Harriet's story is worth telling because it involves no actual harm done, only harm very narrowly avoided, thanks to a single skeptical daughter and a single direct question from an attorney who knew exactly what to ask. Not every family is fortunate enough to catch the mistake in time. Harriet often thinks back to that Saturday morning coffee with Walt, understanding now that his advice, however sincerely offered, had been built entirely on his own family's experience rather than any real legal expertise. Walt genuinely believed what he told her, and his own situation may well have worked out exactly as he described. But every family carries as different circumstances underneath the surface, circumstances a well-meaning neighbor simply has no way of fully knowing. That, more than anything, became the central lesson Harriet carried forward, that even advice offered with complete sincerity deserves independent verification when the stakes involve your own home, your own savings, and your own long-term security. If you are considering simplifying your affairs by adding your children's names to your assets, here is what Harriet's near miss can teach us. Never add a child as a co-owner on your home's deed simply for convenience. A transfer on death deed or a properly structured trust can accomplish the same goal of avoiding probate without exposing your home to your child's own legal or financial circumstances while you're still alive. Never add a child as a joint owner on your bank account just to make things easier. A limited financial power of attorney allows them to help manage your affairs without exposing your entire account to their creditors or legal judgments. Never put a child's name on your car's title purely for convenience. It creates unnecessary legal exposure for them in the event of an accident, with very little practical benefit in exchange. Never name only one child as your life insurance beneficiary based on an informal promise that they will divide the proceeds fairly afterward. Structure the division formally in writing among all intended heirs. And never transfer partial ownership of a property like a family cabin simply to simplify future succession. A will or a properly structured trust can accomplish the same transition without requiring another person's consent for decisions you may still need to make on your own while you're still living. Each of these 5 lessons shares a common thread worth naming directly. The goal behind all of Harriet's original plans was never wrong: simplifying an estate, avoiding probate, making things easier for grieving children during an already difficult time. These are all genuinely worthwhile goals, worth planning for carefully. What Harriet's story illustrates is simply that the specific method matters enormously, and that the version of a solution passed casually between neighbors over coffee is rarely the same as the version a qualified attorney would actually recommend, once all the relevant details are properly considered. Harriet still lives in her own house today, entirely her own, still drives her own car, still owns her bank account outright, protected now not by a neighbor's well-meaning but incomplete advice, but by tools built specifically, carefully, to accomplish exactly what she originally wanted: a simpler, more peaceful transition for her children, without ever putting her own security or theirs at unnecessary risk. Dennis's divorce, incidentally, was finalized several months later, considerably more amicably than it had appeared at its most contentious point. Harriet has often wondered in quiet moments since how differently that entire process might have unfolded for both her son and her own security, had her house, her bank account, and the family cabin already carried his name when the proceedings reached their most difficult stretch. She is deeply grateful every time the thought crosses her mind that Patricia's simple, cautious question and Mrs. Kessler's single, direct follow-up arrived in time to change the entire outcome. Has anyone ever suggested you add your child's name to something for convenience? What did you decide? Tell us in the comments below and let us know what city or country you're watching from tonight. Someone else, about to follow exactly the advice Walt once gave Harriet, might need to read your answer before signing anything at all. If Harriet's story meant something to you, subscribe to Better with Time for more stories from the Dignity years. Because simplifying things for the people you love should never mean quietly signing away your own security to do it.